Hello everyone. Thank you. So I was driving here now. I see hundreds of people lining the streets of 42nd Street. Did you see that? And I was wondering what they're looking at. And they all have cameras. And I really thought there may be some celebrity or something marching down 42nd Street. And as I walked out of my car, I saw what everyone was staring at. This beautiful, large sunset on the west river, on the Hudson River. Literally like a huge ball. You'll probably all see it in the news tonight. So everyone was mesmerized. It was quite a scene to see in Manhattan. People get affected by something that's natural. Like they say in insurance policies, acts of God, as opposed to man-made sensations. So, not that it has a particular connection to the class tonight, but I just thought I'd mention it. It probably does have a connection anyway. I was always mentioned here the words of the Baal Shem Tov, that the difference between nature and a miracle is only one little thing. It's frequency. If the sun were to rise or to set once in our lifetimes, so we'd all see it as a great miracle. But since it happens every day, we get used to it. So it's not that it's less of a miracle, it's just that we are fickle human beings and constantly need new sensations and new rushes and new highs to get us excited. But in truth, every breath we take and every step we make and every move is itself a miracle. And sadly, we usually appreciate it when someone is lacking it. When you see someone struggling to breathe or someone struggling for any other aspect of life that we take for granted, you suddenly realize what kind of combination, how many miracles have to happen for just one breath to take place. So I thought it was an interesting sight to behold, and hopefully everyone can hold on to it, and not just as a nice picture, photo opportunity, but as a segue into our discussion here. I also bring you warm regards from the Holy Land, where I just arrived from 24 hours ago. I was sitting in Jerusalem and thinking I will soon be in New York. And now I'm in New York thinking about Jerusalem. So it's interesting, two different parts of the world. Right before we landed here, I noticed it's around 7,000 miles between here and Jerusalem. And many more miles, I guess, spiritually. Not that the people there are necessarily closer to Jerusalem than we are, but physically they are. Here we have a Jerusalem-born native sitting with us right here. So he's a holy soul. Velvel back there, Velvel. Is a live specimen. So I bring you warm regards from our Holy Land, Promised Land, where I spent a week, and I said some prayers for some of you that asked me to do so. So I hope they're all fulfilled to the fullest and beyond. And now that we're in the 3 weeks, and 3 weeks which began this past Shabbos, being that we don't fast on a Shabbos, so actually the 3 weeks began on a Sunday. So Tisha B'Av will be the same. Even if Mashiach comes, the day will turn into a great holiday. The question is whether the holiday will be on Shabbos or will be on Sunday. Because the fast day can't be on Shabbos, so it'll have to be on Sunday. So we have to say that probably Mashiach comes and Shabbos is Tisha B'Av and Sunday is... Well, that's something we could all speculate about. But the 3 weeks is a period in time, the saddest period of the Jewish calendar, when we commemorate the siege and then the destruction of the temples, both temples. One 1944 years ago, and the other one add another 490 years to that, was the first temple. And both, interestingly, the same period of time as when they were destroyed, by completely two different nations. It was the Babylonians that destroyed the first temple. And there are different opinions when the siege began around Jerusalem. You know, Jerusalem has a wall around it. That wall existed also back then, even though it was rebuilt several times, but Jerusalem was always a walled city. So a walled city, the cities of old, the ones that were walled were usually considered the holy cities, special cities. They were walled for a reason, because to protect them from siege. So Jerusalem was protected from the siege, but the walls were besieged on the 17th of Tammuz, which would have been last Shabbos. That's the beginning of the 3 weeks. And 3 weeks later, the Babylonians, there's an opinion that it happened on the 10th of Tammuz by Babylon. But there's also an opinion the 17th of Tammuz. But 3 weeks later, to the day, is when they finally broke through the wall and burned down the temple. So it was the 3 weeks of intensified siege of Jerusalem till they finally destroyed the temple. That was Babylonians. That temple stood for 410 years. That was the temple built by King Solomon, and by King David and King Solomon. And then came 70 years after the destruction by the Babylonians, where the Jews were exiled to Babylon, and more or less to the east of Israel, that is. And then 70 years later, they rebuilt the temple, the second temple, which was greater than the first. It was larger and also stood for 10 more years. It stood for 420 years. Now, the second temple was exactly the same thing happened. On the 17th of Tammuz, this time it was the Romans that besieged the city. And then 3 weeks later, less than 3 weeks, but they pierced the walls. And finally, on the 9th of Av, which is the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, they burned down the second temple. Which is itself an interesting fact that this happened exactly the same day, same period in time. And we honor this every year with what we call the 3 weeks. 3 weeks, or another word for it in the book of Echa, Lamentations, it's called Bein Hamtzarim, which means between the straits, between the dire or narrow straits. So sometimes these 3 weeks are called between the straits, the strait of 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, the 3 weeks, from when the siege began to when the temple was destroyed. And on a very practical level, mechanically speaking, we don't perform weddings during this period of time. It's like a form of grieving, though the fast is only the beginning and the first and the end of only the two punctuated times is the beginning and the end of the 3 weeks, but nevertheless the 3 weeks are considered to be a sad mourning period. And Tisha B'Av, of course, is the intensity of it, which is a 24-hour fast day, and we dim the lights, and we say special prayers, and it's literally sitting Shiva for the Beis HaMikdash, for the Holy Temple. So the technical part, many of us are aware of, or if you're not aware of, now you're aware of it. And the part that's harder to understand, or I wouldn't say harder to understand, that's less known, is why. Why do we still grieve over a Beis HaMikdash, a temple that stood so many thousands of years ago? In Jewish law, when you sit Shiva, God forbid, for someone that's passed away, a parent, you're not allowed to sit more than 7 days Shiva. It's regulated. It says not less than 7, not more than 7. It's one of the reasons it's called Shiva. Shiva means to sit, but it also means 7 days, Shiva. Because the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law says that if you sit longer than, if you overgrieve, it's overindulging, and it's not considered to be sensitive. And if you do it less, it's also not considered to be sensitive. So here we're sitting Shiva now, as I said, 1,944 years for the second temple. And what 1944 plus 490 is what, Jeff? You got your numbers? 1944 plus 490 is 1944 plus 400 is 2344. 2444, 2434. Okay. For the second temple, for the first temple. How is that consistent with this law? You're not supposed to sit Shiva even for a parent more than 7 days. This is already thousands of years. How much can we indulge in grieving over a building? Not even a life, not even a human being. So that's the first obvious question. And on a more contemporary terms, what's the significance of just remembering destruction? I mean, how long can we dwell on it? Isn't health and growth all based on growing through our pain and not wallowing in it? I mean, every type of growth is all about, yes, there's a point where we have to grieve and a point where we have to cry, but there's a point we have to get over the crying and grow from it. So why do we still remember it to the extent that we really don't make weddings? It's not just a theory, you don't just read about it, it actually affects our lives. To the point, as I said, Tisha B'Av and Shavasar Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, are actual fast days. So clearly there's much more going on here than meets the eye. Because though Jews definitely have suffered, but as I pointed out many times, we've not become sufferers. And in fact, as Jews have gone through and grown through the harshest and most difficult situations. Take the Holocaust. So clearly there's something deeper here that's part of, that has a much more psychological and personal relevance than just the mere fact that we're remembering the destruction of a temple so many thousands of years ago. Now, to really appreciate it, in truth, modern psychology is approximately 100 years old. Freud is considered to be the father of modern psychology. You don't hear really about many psychologists. You find very few people that can mention a psychologist before Freud. You know, anybody here can mention one name? So everything we know about psychology is really in the last 100 years. I mean, and there were psychologists, there were people who wrote about it and thought about it, but he marketed it best, maybe. And he turned it into what they call a psychological system. Now, there are many detractors and many different opinions. Carl Jung and other great thinkers and psychologists had a different approach. Viktor Frankl and others. But nevertheless, Freud is still considered to be the dominating figure. Even if you disagree with him, he's the one that you disagree with. He has that type of authority. The truth is, besides the fact that Freud himself was Jewish and learned a lot from his Jewish mother, which gave many theories about Jewish mothers and so on, many of his theories. Besides the fact of that, the fact is anyone studies Torah, and I'm not even getting into the mystical now, which we will get into. Even Talmudic thought is deeply psychological. It's all about psychology. It's all about the theories of what makes human beings tick, and that regulates our behavior and how we interact with each other. Just to take an example, there's a central law in Torah that says, in the Talmud, that says that if there's a disagreement between two people, and one person says, that I lent you $5,000. Another person says, no, it was only $2,000. So how do you resolve this? So obviously, if you have evidence, contracts, that can prove it. But let's say there was nothing written and there are no witnesses. So the Talmud gives rules that someone who denies only part of the claim has to take an oath, and then they're believed. So they swear, I only owe you 2,000, not 5,000, and then they believe them. If someone, however, denies it all, then it's a whole different story. Why? It's a whole different story. You can't just believe them. Why do you believe someone who only admits half of it? Well, seemingly the logic would be because he's admitting it, but maybe he's lying. Maybe he's trying to get off $3,000. The reason is, the Talmud says, because ein adam meiz b'fnei bal chevei. Because the nature of a human being is not to have chutzpah in front of someone that you owe something to. So he's admitting that he owes. That means he's indebted to this person. That the nature of a normal person would not be to lie in the face of someone that you owe something to. So if he denies it all, you don't know whether he's indebted to him or not. You don't know. Maybe he's just a total liar. The fact that he's admitting that already proves that he's acknowledging it. So you give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, of course, there are later scholars that say, one second, we find people who do have chutzpah to people that they're indebted to. We see this all the time. I'm sure, I hope it has never happened to you, but unfortunately this happens more often than not, where people say, look, I did something for someone and look how they treated me in return, when I needed something in return. So one of the cynical scholars says, the Talmud says, Ein adam meiz b'nei. You have to be an adam, you have to be a human being. A human being will not have that type of chutzpah. But if you're not human, you could have that type of chutzpah. In other words, there's subhuman people. That's how some explain. But that's not what I wanted to get into. The point I'm saying here, this is a message, a psychological lesson. That means a healthy human being everyone has their boundaries, has shame, has some conscience. And that if someone admits partially, You could trust them if they take an oath. The oath really just demonstrates that they're really serious. So they know that the consequences. They take an oath. They swear that yes, just like we take today in court of law, that I swear to tell the truth and so on. So just to get, it was a small example. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like this in Talmudic thinking that all talk about the nature, the psychology of human beings. What humans would do, what we wouldn't do. Certain things are in the scope of human nature, certain things are outside of that scope. Everyone has their taboos, so to speak, has their fears. I'm talking now healthy circumstances. Now, of course, it gets more complicated when it's not healthy. When something, for example, some abuse or dysfunctionality affects us in our lives, we will do things that we're not naturally wired to do because we become more desperate. So left to our own accord, in more or less normal circumstances, there are certain things each of us have our nature, our personalities. Should we be pushed, or should we be compelled, or in some way, some type of aberration takes place in our life, some violation, then we will often also change our personalities to adjust or adapt to it, which is, of course, what makes things much more complicated. Because then people will do things, as I said, that they naturally wouldn't do. And you could probably even identify in your own life some things that there was a point in your life where, to that point you wouldn't have done something, then something happened and you did it. And then you can't turn back so quickly. Once you so-called taste from the forbidden fruit, or you do something that you naturally would not do, now you've done it. You're a different person after that. So in discussing psychology, the truth is, without dismissing what contemporary and modern psychology says, the fact is, as Jews, the Torah can pull rank, because it's thousands and thousands of years of psychological depth. And this wasn't just theories. You're talking about a people, the Jewish people that is, that really actually suffered. So they had to deal with digging very deep into their own deeper resources to cope with most challenging situations. Who best would you want to have wisdom from than someone who suffered and learned how to not only survive but to thrive? You have a verse in the book of Exodus, right in the beginning of Shemais, that says, as the Jews were oppressed by the Egyptians, that's how they multiplied and they thrived and they grew. There you have the lesson that you hear so often in almost all healing circles. That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Or we are like a tea bag. You don't know how strong someone is until you put them into hot water. They say that sometimes about women. In other words, the concept, the idea that suffering, not that it can be justified, it's never justified, but the result of it can end up either breaking somebody or you can make someone much stronger. That's who you'd want to turn to if you wanted to have psychological advice. Who would you turn to? You turn to someone who's a veteran, who's a war-torn veteran, someone who's gone through and has been wounded and has come out stronger. So the Jewish people as a whole and as individuals carry these type of messages. So I find it like, I remember when 9/11 took place, it was one of the first things I wrote about, and it struck me was that we as a people have seen the abyss, we've seen darkness. We can teach the world a lot about it. Not about the darkness, how to cope with it, how to deal with it, how not to be destroyed by it. So as we shall see, the 3 weeks and this period in time, when you really look and dig deeper, you would come to realize this really is a formula of maybe the most complex and most sophisticated psychological approach to life. Now, obviously, the entire Jewish calendar is a formula, and you have high moments and you have low moments, high points and low points. You have the great holidays like Simchas Torah and obviously Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and you have Purim and Chanukah and Passover and Shavuos. I did my book 60 Days, which really begins the month of Elul next month, but it actually begins now, because it begins from after the breaking of the tablets and so on, which I shall soon discuss as well. So all these cycles have many lessons to us in our own psyches and our own psychological ups and downs in life. But what I'm focusing tonight is on the 3 weeks. As you shall see, the 3 weeks, including the number 3, is deeply significant and has profound insights that is relevant to every one of us, no matter what we're struggling with. That's what I want to address here now. And hopefully in the coming weeks, being that the 3 weeks are just the beginning of a period that then continues, after the 3 weeks continues, as the Talmud says, 7 weeks of comfort and 2 weeks of return. So you have really a cycle here of 3, 7, and 2, 12 weeks. The 3 weeks that we're in now, this is the first of the 3 weeks. Then will come, as I said, after Tisha B'Av will be another 7 weeks called the 7 Shivat and Nechemta, 7 weeks of comfort, which concludes the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. And then come 2 weeks, which is the Shabbos, the 2 weeks after between Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, which are called the 2 weeks of return. So this cycle of 12 weeks is not just a random cycle. From between the 2 Shabbos between Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot. This cycle is a process that we all go through, and more importantly, it's a process that helps us grow through any type of challenge. So now, of course, we're in the so-called descent into the 3 weeks. This is the 3 weeks, as I call it, Bein HaMetzorim, between the dire straits. I don't know if that rock group got it from Bein HaMetzorim, but the dire straits is actually a verse in the book of Lamentations. I'm sure, being that Mark Knopfler is a Jew, I'm sure that's where he picked it up from. So let me first begin with a few introductions. One of the key elements in psychology, Torah psychology, Torah-based psychology, is a very simple but fundamental principle, and that is distinction between symptoms and roots, called symptomatic medicine. You have a headache, you take an aspirin. You have a cut in your finger, God forbid, you put on a Band-Aid. These are called dealing with symptoms, which are all fine when you're dealing with superficial wounds. Just to stop the bleeding, or whatever it is, to get rid of the symptoms. But when you're dealing with deeper wounds, symptoms are just a symptom. They're just the tip of the iceberg. They're the result of something. So true healing is, of course, getting to the root of something. But the root of things poses 2 challenges to us. Number one, they're not that visible. Symptoms are visible. Roots are not. Secondly, we don't like to address roots. It's very uncomfortable. It's much easier to address symptoms. I can tell you from my own little experience, and I've heard this from many, almost, I don't want to say always, but I would say almost always, when someone shares a problem, I'm not talking about a superficial, real problem in their lives, whether it's an emotional issue, personal issue, in relationships, dealing with others, whatever it may be, usually their description of the problem is not the problem. They describe the symptoms of the problem. They describe the problem as they perceive it or how it affects them. But the roots of the problem, not because people hide it, but because most people are not even aware of their own roots, because our subjectivity doesn't let us see it, and we don't. And more importantly, or equally importantly, is we don't want to see it because it may be too painful. So what we show, what we can see, is the tip of the iceberg. That's called the symptoms. So the first rule is you have to always look for those deeper roots. This doesn't mean that we have to always dig to the core of problems. If you can solve it on the symptomatic level, great. No need to go further. There's no need to dig up the past and regress into our childhoods. But sometimes that may not be sufficient just to deal with it on the symptom level. When I was researching this years ago, the Torah approach to psychology, is it behavioral, or is it therapeutic, as they say? Behavioral psychology deals more with change of habits, change of routines, change of behavior. And that itself, so if people, let's say a couple are not getting along, work on them with routines, acknowledging, saying thank you, going out of their way to do something. Even on a basic, actual level, even if they don't feel it, just do it, and ultimately that brings the feelings. That's an approach, and it's an approach that's proven to work in many situations. And there's another approach, is not to go from the behavior, not travel from outward in, but out from the inside out. Look at the deeper issues, like why is there resentment or something. Try to find out what's the deeper cause and work on it from that end, and then the behavior automatically will change. So it's really, you could think of it almost as contradictory approaches. So I looked into it from a Torah point of view, and the truth is the Torah says both are correct, and you really need to attack it from both angles. think of it, you have to attack it from the outside, simply on a behavioral level, but also from within, on a more unconscious level or more root level, type of, as I said, not symptomatic medicine, but remedial. Not remedial or symptomatic medicine, but something that is more rooted from the cause or the root. And the truth is, they both complement each other, and if you do it properly, you can really get somewhere. But these are just general principles which obviously have to be applied case by case to each individual situation. There's no rules. There are general guidelines, but there's no rule to say, okay, this is... Then you apply it to people's situations. But the first thing you want to always look for is what are the deeper causes, especially when you're dealing with deeper, with long-term issues, with complicated stuff, with stuff that people cannot resolve. That's always a sign that there's something more going on. Band-Aid doesn't help. An aspirin doesn't help. So clearly, there's something deeper. So that's number one. Point number two is that no problems begin no problems begin suddenly overnight. Everything slowly deteriorates. Meaning, any problem does not begin as a big problem. It begins as a small problem. Left unchecked, it begins to accumulate. And as it begins to accumulate, mistake leads to mistake. And then, there's a point, just like when we get lost. You don't suddenly get lost. You're on the road. You go in the right direction. But then you veer off a drop. And then you continue going. Now, as you continue, if you stop right there, so you're not that far off, you may find your way back. But if you continue going, and especially the faster you go, and the more desperate you become, so the faster you get lost, until a point you come to a point that you're somewhere in the woods, you have no clue how to get back. Psychologically speaking, that means that you're now developing new tools and new approaches that have completely wandered away from your original objective or what your objective should be. And it gets even worse than that. At some point, you convince yourself you're not even lost. You convince yourself, when you're off a road and you're somewhere lost in a forest, you know pretty well that you're lost. But psychologically, you convince yourself that you're not lost. It may be inconvenient to you to think you're lost. So you suddenly start creating a philosophy around your distortions. And then you develop a new identity based on the mistakes that have been made. Not always intentionally. It's not necessarily malicious or deliberate or premeditated. It's just a fact of life. We are very resilient, and we figure out we are creative, and we can suddenly create a whole new way of life based on aberrations. So that's point number two. And point number three is that all problems begin in a vacuum. Nothing just starts out of nowhere. Why do you veer off the road in the first place? Either you don't have a roadmap, or you don't have lights, or there's something that's lacking. People just don't veer off. Now think of it this way. Children, as they're born, pure children, innocent children, what would cause them to suddenly turn at some point in life to mess up their lives? It's a big question everyone likes to know. Here was this little child I was cradling once, completely vulnerable, completely pure and innocent, and now look at this child grown into an adult and gets into complete deep trouble. I'm talking an extreme situation. I'm not talking about how do you get from here to here. So of course I just said nothing happens overnight. But what's the beginning roots of it? Beginning roots is always a vacuum. There's something lacking. If the child did not get enough love, or the child had bad influences, or parents who maybe with good intentions or not good intentions did whatever they did and let the child not develop or did not nurture that child properly, there's a vacuum. There's a hunger. And when there's hunger, there's a need to fill the hunger. Nature abhors a vacuum, and even more so does the psyche. Because the human psyche, like the soul, is a hungry force. It's energy. Energy needs fuel. And if it doesn't get fuel, it's going to become very, very desperate. And if it doesn't get it from a healthy place, it'll get it from an unhealthy place. The thing is, vacuums are invisible. You can't see a vacuum while it's developing. You only see it after someone acts out. You suddenly see someone behave in a certain way. You say, hey, what happened? You suddenly realize, hey, there must be something really serious going on. So the Torah's way of looking at things is to teach us how to train our eyes and our minds and our hearts to look beneath the surface. Because the common point in all that I've just said here about the difference between roots and symptoms The difference between a slow development of veering off until you completely get lost, and the vacuum, these are all forces that are invisible. By the time we're already reacting to it, it's already become a monster usually. And that's why it's so difficult. If you're able to nip it in its bud, you have a lot easier solutions. So like how marriages deteriorate. They don't deteriorate overnight. Suddenly a marriage deteriorates. Again, I'm not talking about extreme situations where there's things, every situation has its own particular complexion. But in a marriage where it doesn't deteriorate overnight, something starts happening that nobody really notices is a big thing. Or even if you do notice, it's what's it called? The pit patted away, whatever they call it. Dismissed. There's a word for it. With a P. Okay. Anyway, it's dismissed as nothing serious. And then it starts to fester. Like infections. Some of the worst infections that infest the body, they become to a point that they become killer infections, usually, almost in all cases, begin very small. And if it was found or checked then, could have been prevented. Either because it was ignored or because it wasn't visible. And it began to develop, and then at some point it's like a wildfire. Like a fire, actually. Fire only begins, blazing fire, it begins with a spark. It begins with electrical accident, something like that. So all these are lessons that teach us many things. And right now in our own lives, as we're sitting here, how kind of ticking time bomb is there right now inside of us that we're not even aware of? And I'm not trying to frighten anyone. I'm just suggesting is that that most of the workings that are going on within us are invisible to us. And by the time they become visible, you're already dealing now with a blazing fire, usually. But the point of this discussion is that we don't have to wait for it to be that way, because as we acclimate ourselves, we become more sensitive to the forces that are not so visible, we actually can catch many things that you would not catch on your own. And the 3 weeks, this period in time, is exactly for that purpose. That's why we sit now, and we remember something that happened thousands of years ago, not because we're interested in living in the past, and we're wallowing in our misery, or that's not at all the point. The point is the exact opposite. It's a period in time. The Jewish calendar and its wisdom focuses different periods of the different months of the year, focus on different aspects of our lives. And this period in time is meant to help us focus in on these forces that we all go through, the forces that cause destruction. The temple really is essentially a symbol here. What is the symbolism of the temple? The temple actually was structured like the human body. A few years ago, I gave classes on this subject, how the temple is like a microcosm of the human body, which is a microcosm of the entire cosmic order, of the divine structure of existence. So the temple actually had 3 sections, like the body does. It had like a head, a torso, body, and legs. So you have in the temple the Holy of Holies. What the Holy of Holies was like the central nervous system. It was the head. That's where the Torah was, the mind, the ark. Then came the body, which is the Kodesh, the section called the Holy, which had 3 parts to it. A center, like the heart, a right arm, and a left arm. So you had in the center, you had the altar. On the right, you had the table, and on the left, you had the menorah. And then came the chutzner, which is the outer dimension, the largest part of the temple, which is considered like the legs. And now you have the outer altar, the altar that connects us to the world around us. Our legs is what walks on this earth. It carries us from place to place. So I'm not going to go through the details of this, of the microcosm, macrocosm, and parallels, because I did this a number of years ago, and I think I may have written it up as well. If you want more information, you just go to our website and a little search. If you need a little Google, it can help. If you need more help, you just send us an email, and I'll be happy to send you. So the temple was a symbol of us. As a matter of fact, the Torah says it explicitly. It says in the beginning, in the book of Exodus, Shmos, when God says to Moses to build me a temple, He says, "V'aseh li migdash, build for me a sanctuary, v'shechanti b'seichem, and I will rest, I will dwell among them." Them is the operative word. Not I will dwell in it, in the building. I will dwell among them. The building is them. Because the purpose was not God dwelling in bricks and mortar or materials and tapestries. It was to dwell in the hearts and souls of human beings. So the temple was essentially a symbol of each one of us. And when the divine dwells within us, you have harmony. The harmony that is the essence of all psychological health. The harmony between spirit and matter. Or in simple English, between what you are and what you do. Who you are and what you do. You ask most people who you are, who are you? They show you their business card. But a business card tells you what you do at best, not who you are. All of us suffer from a dichotomy of who we are and what we do. Which is why suddenly one day we wake up and we say, why am I doing all of this? Like, is this who I am or I'm not? It's been imposed upon me. Am I doing it to make a living? Other people's expectations, demands, my parents, etc., etc. Not that easy to answer the question, who are you? Who am I? Because did you really even know? Maybe who you are is what's been defined to you by your education and by your educators and your teachers and your parents and all the people who've made demands and expectations of you. So, if you want to say the first vacuum or the first so-called distortion of them all is that dichotomy, the disparity or the dissonance between who you are and what you do. In mystical terms, that would be the dissonance between spirit and matter, or between God and the universe. So though I'm using the word God, I'm hesitant to use it because for many people, spirit and matter, they make sense to them. As soon as you use God, it sounds religious. And that's like, we don't relate to. And as you know, God is just a word. You can use whatever word you like. When the temple was destroyed, or that's before the temple was destroyed, when the temple stood, it symbolized a harmony between matter and spirit, between what you are and what you do, who you are and what you do, between your soul and your actions. The destruction of the temple symbolizes a schism, a split between these two forces. And the reason the temple was destroyed, the second temple specifically, was because of baseless hatred. The people disliked each other. So you say, what does one thing happen next? People dislike each other. Why is the temple destroyed? Because God cannot rest among people who don't get along with each other. There can be no harmony between spirit and matter if there's no harmony between one and another. So the concept of unity on all levels is essentially the appreciation that spirit dominates our lives. So what would you say dominates the world today in the 21st century? It's not spirit, it's matter. Materialism. What you own, what you conquer, what you acquire, what kind of home you live in. All the things that we are so proud of, that we compete with each other for. What class you belong to, how much equity you have. All material things. Spirit is not really valued in the world in which we live. At the same time, each of us individually knows that spirit is maybe more important than matter. Intellectually, we definitely know that. But we live in a world where we are basically pressured to conform, and it's a dog-eats-dog world, and that's how it is. And even those of us that believe that our souls are not completely been swallowed up by this material drive, no, it's not that simple to live that way. So we try to find all kinds of, we fabricate all kinds of concoctions of how we reconcile these two worlds. I'd love to compare notes one day, if we had the time, to hear how you do this. But people, this is to me one of my, I can't call it hobbies, because it's more than a hobby, it's my life. But it's always interesting to me how people figure out, because you ask any individual, they'll say, you ask them, what's more important, love or money? Everyone will say love. Yeah, but then, bottom line is they don't necessarily behave that way. So we could see how, because our ideals are always far ahead of our actions. That's how it works. And our pride and our own sensitivity doesn't let us even acknowledge. Now there are some people who will just tell you straight out, I once thought it was this, but let's be honest, it's all about power and money and so on and so forth. But then again, somebody, you can't take the power of money with you once you leave this earth. Okay, fine, I'll worry about that then. Meanwhile, it has hypnotic, seductive power. And if you could show me how many people you know where spirit dominates, and I mean in action. I know many people who are very godly people until that comes to the bank account. You know? In other words, God, but there's a limit where you let God in. There's a point where God does not enter. Everybody's got that place. So when the Meraglim, the scouts, a few weeks ago in the Torah we read, they didn't want to enter the promised land. Why wouldn't they want to enter the promised land? These were the greatest leaders of their time. They had heard that God had promised this land. They knew that we had suffered hundreds of years, all to get back to this promised land. Jacob left it only because of a famine and made a vow that he would return. And he had a promise from God that they would return. Why suddenly they get cold feet? They saw the miracles. They saw God led them out of Egypt. How could such great people suddenly get cold feet? The big question. And the answer is precisely because they were so great. They were spiritual. They could not see how we could survive in a material world. And they used the classic 3 words that I think captures any generation, including ours own. You want to capture the economic woes of our last few years? Read the 3 words that the Meraglim say. They say, Eretz Echeles Ishvel. The material world, this land that we went to visit, is a land that consumes its inhabitants. Is there a better way to capture what happens to people when money affects them? It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. I mean, I've never found a better way to express. You see it. I had a guy came over to me who was riding high, before the meltdown, whatever you call it, the bubble burst. And he said to me, he screwed so many friends of his. He thought he's riding high, and he kind of justified it. And then he suddenly realized what happened to him. He says, "I sold my soul." He worked for Goldman Sachs. I mean, one after the other. Some admit it, some won't. Because money has that hypnotic, seductive power. It distorts your mind. And it even convinces you that you can be a righteous person. I'll make more money. I'll be very charitable. I'll have a lot of power. I can do things with it. Tell me the people who become generous after they become wealthy. If you're generous, you're generous. If you're not, you're not. Rarely do you find someone who becomes generous after they become wealthy. If they're generous, they'll give you a penny if they have a penny, if they have 10 pennies. And if they're not generous, they won't give you the penny, and they won't give you the million even if they have billions. That's how it works. Check it out. Generosity is a thing from the spirit. It's nothing to do with how much you have. It's an attitude. And you can justify anything. You can justify, listen, the more I make, the more interest I can bear, and then I can give more. But you end up not giving. You end up dying before you start giving after taking so much. Because money, as materialism, is the way God created it, is that it consumes its inhabitants. And the scouts are right, it does consume its inhabitants. Their big grave error was, and by the way, that was the first Tisha B'Av. When the scouts came back with that bad report and the Jews cried that night, they didn't want to go into the promised land, that was the first 3 weeks, essentially, the end of the 3 weeks. What was their mistake? The mistake was not that they were wrong. It does consume its inhabitants, but God said, that's exactly where I want you to go into a land that on its own has the power to consume you, and you consume it. And that's what the other two, Kalev and Yeshua, said. No, it's a land that will become our bread and our sustenance. We will consume it, not it will consume us. In other words, we will use materialism as something that will fuel our spirituality, not the other way around. So basically, God said, yes, it's a challenge, and that's exactly what I'm telling you. Go into this challenging world and figure out how you don't let it control you, you control it. It's a whole different attitude to life. That the material world, with all its powers, is really basically a platform, a platform, an environment for us to turn into something, into a temple. But the power cannot be denied, and the power does affect most people. And as it affects most people, what happens is it begins to create a very serious dissonance between matter and spirit. So what happens to our souls in the process? But as the scouts say, either it gets consumed by this materialism, or it gets severely compromised. So what most of us do is we compartmentalize. We begin to compartmentalize. Compartmentalize means, most of my time in my life is involved in material survival, and then we find our weekends and our vacations and the moments where we can experience something that's called transcendence. But it's like 2 lives. It's almost like 2 identities, which itself takes its toll after a while. So basically, the building of the temple and the destruction of the temple is symbolic of this either harmony or schism that I've been describing here. And that's why we commemorate it, because it's something that we're living through today. It's not something that happened thousands of years ago. We each have these 2 options. And this time of the year is when we focus on this issue of this dissonance, this disparity within our own lives. And unfortunately, in most cases, it leads to destruction, not necessarily to harmony. But the goal of all this is that it shouldn't lead to that, and that's why we discuss it. Because if you address the issue, and you nip it in the bud, and you can look at it take the bull by the horns and look at it in its eyes, before it affects you, then, of course, that's the best way to preempt most of our problems. So the 3 weeks is meaningly really looking into the face of the enemy, eye to eye, and not fearing it, and learning how to grow through it. And that's why we remember what happened then, because we want to show that we have that power. We don't run away from our fears. So in a way you could say the 3 weeks, the Bein Hamtzarim, what I said before, the dire straits. We all have our dire straits. It comes from the same word as Mitzrayim, which I've often discussed as when we leave Egypt. Is the same idea, going out of the constraints and straits of our lives. In Hebrew, Meitzar means boundary. But psychologically speaking, a boundary means anything that keeps you trapped. So you can fill in the blanks by whatever you want to call your straits. You can call it fear, your fears, your inhibitions, your insecurities, your emotional vulnerabilities, whatever you want to call it. Internal forces inside of you that somewhat paralyze you. So that's what the 3 weeks are about. But it gets deeper than that. We understand what exactly is the process that leads a person to, as I said, to wander away from themselves. And that's what the 3 weeks are about. Three stages. Three stages. This is pretty, I can't say common, but I've heard this quite often. I heard it recently again. Let's talk about shalom bias issues. People who have issues, husband and wife. Domestic issues, as they call it. And there comes a point where usually people go for help to therapy or to a counselor, or they may come see me. It's usually not when things are working great. It's usually when things aren't working great. Why would they come see somebody if everything is great, right? Even though that may be a good time to go, actually. It's just like as you go for a checkup, like a health checkup, make sure everything is fine. As I said, you don't see usually the things that are brewing, but there's always something going on. But usually when things aren't working. And so I have a situation recently, someone shares it with me, that we have not had any, husband and wife have not had any intimacy now for months and months. And it's only causing more and more resentment and more deterioration of our relationship. Because at least we had that. At least we had physical connection. Once that is gone, what's left? So I asked the person who shared this with me, I said, well, what brought to that? Obviously, of course, you start digging, you start finding it didn't just happen. As I said before, it doesn't just happen suddenly. It took time. And as a result of different distrusts, different arguments, and slowly things break down. At some point, a person doesn't want to be with the other person anymore. It's not just purely about sex and about physical connection. It also has to have some type of warmth and attraction. And you can love somebody, but then if you stop respecting them, or you start getting have a lot of ill feelings toward them, it undermines any type of relationship. Yes, it's true for some people. Through sexuality and intimacy, they cover up a lot of their problems. That happens for some, but some it doesn't happen that way. I don't know which one is worse. But the bottom line is, so how do you deal with something like this? So I'm just using that as a case, as a model here, a case study that I think you can apply the 3 weeks. So Hillel Parisher is one of the great Chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he wrote actually a discourse which is based on the Rebbe's that he heard these ideas from. It's a mysticism, Kabbalistic and Hasidic discourse. He talks about the 3 weeks and the 7 weeks that follow, and then the 2 that come after that. But I'm going to focus on the 3 right now because that's where we are. The other ones will come following weeks. He talks about using an example, which is maybe somewhat of a abstract, I can't call it an abstract example, but it's an excellent example, as you'll see. I'll soon apply it to the situation I just described and many other situations. He uses explanation that in any type of what I called before dissonance or disparity or schism whatever, disharmony. Some things are not aligned. When something is not aligned, we all have moments, and maybe more than moments in our lives, where things are not aligned. You identify with this statement? Okay, good. I want to make sure that I'm not dealing with perfect human beings here. Okay, so I know we're not perfect. So when things are not aligned, so as I said before, there are three key factors. One is that we don't see the roots. We only see symptoms. At best, sometimes even symptoms, we don't see all of them. Number two, that nothing happens suddenly. Everything takes time until it develops and accumulates. And three, that it all begins with a vacuum. Something's missing that causes the rest to follow, to spiral out of control. So when we talk about any type of disharmony like this, again, on all levels, the example that he uses, which is an example used in Hasidic thought, I think is my phone. I shut it off actually. Sorry. Yeah, I did shut it off. But anyway, so the example he uses is the example of a teacher and a student. And I'll explain before I explain the example, let me just say this. You see, in the context of what I described till now, and this is a fourth critical point. I made 3 points. This is a very, very important point. And that is, in Jewish thought, there's no such thing as a problem. It's what's called a challenge. Everything is a potential solution. The problem is when you convince yourself that you only see this moment, which is the problem, and you don't see the process. So, like I mentioned, point number 2, which is that everything is a process, just like it's a process. You don't just get lost overnight. It takes time. There's also, even when you do get lost, it's a process to lead you somewhere else. I discussed this, I believe, 2 weeks ago, in the context of a journey. When you're on a journey, and especially the way we think, this fast food generation, we think of everything as disjointed parts. Right now, this is the frame that you're in. You don't see your life as a series of frames of a larger story, a larger narrative. You only see that later in life. When you look back, you just realize that the serendipity or the things are not as random as they seemed. Things led you places. But while you're in it, especially if it's a painful situation, very difficult to see it's part of a process of growth. But if you look around in life, everything is a process. A seed is rotting in the ground. If you're able to get into the head of that seed and have an interview with the seed and say, what do you feel like now? I'm deteriorating. I'm rotting. I'm disappearing. I'm going to be dead soon. That's what you think the seed would say. I assume the seed is wiser than that and probably knows that it's going to turn into a sapling which will sprout and then blossom and then ultimately will be a great tree one day. But regardless of what the seed knows or doesn't know, there's no question there's two perspectives. If you live in the moment, it looks like death. Just like a caterpillar as it goes into the chrysalis, into the cocoon, also it seems like it's dying, only to give birth to a beautiful butterfly. Everything in life is a metamorphosis. Everything in life is a transition going from one place to another. But we are myopic human being creatures. We think of the moment. Very hard for us to see the bigger picture, especially when we are in pain. We're not in pain. You have the comfort. You may step back and say, there's a process. The truth is, when we're not in pain, we take for granted the moment. So then we have a different type of blindness. But when we are in pain, we see the moment, and it doesn't help if someone tells you, hey, don't be so much in pain. It's only a process going somewhere. And it's not even necessarily a sensitive thing to say. I'm saying it now because we're talking here theoretically. I'm not talking, I would never say this to someone who's suffering and say, listen, you're going to get over it. The suffering is going to lead you somewhere. There's a point where you need to have empathy. In that period, as I said, there's a time you have to cry. You have to cry. You can't tell someone don't cry because the tears one day are going to give birth to beautiful fruit. Now you have to cry. There's a time to cry. There's a time to celebrate. So, but when you step back and it's not personal, like we talk about the 3 weeks, it's a process. It's a process. And this process is one that therefore looks at any situation, even the negative ones, even the fears that I mentioned, inhibitions, all the things that the dire straits, Beinam Tsarim, it sees it as part of a process to get somewhere. So not to go over to the analogy, you'll see how the analogy works. So the analogy gives us of a teacher who is transmitting knowledge to a student that the teacher loves. At some point, the teacher has taught enough to the student and wants to now, he has a certain urge to reveal to the student some new revelation, something never said before. But in order to reveal it, it's not that simple. It can't just be, it's not part of yesterday's study. So now I'm going to teach something new. So the teacher has to fall silent to prepare himself for this new idea, to be able to share it. Also to prepare the student to something new. Just continue talking, it'll appear that it's just an extension of yesterday's ideas. So a new revelation always will be preceded by some type of silence. The teacher withdraws into himself, preparing himself for this great revelation that's coming from the deepest love that he has for a student. From the student's perspective, however, this deepest love is not, there's no transmission going on in that moment. He felt closer the day before when he was getting some ideas, because he's not hearing anything from the teacher right now. Right now it's silent. That silence can be misconstrued and misunderstood, and when it is, that's called golus, that's called darkness. It's basically a misunderstood concealment. When the concealment is only in order to reveal something deeper, at the moment it feels like a concealment. Now that alone is not a bad thing if the student was wise enough. But if the student is not wise enough and sees it as actually a concealment, he can just pick himself up and say, you know what? My teacher fell asleep, or my teacher has abandoned me, is absentee, and I'm out of here. By the time the teacher is ready to reveal, the student has left. This is how he describes this period in time, which is really a description of the general picture of what the Kabbalists call, very often mentioned here, the tzimtzum, the great tzimtzum, God's concealment of His presence in order to reveal something far deeper. So when a healthy parent exercises restraint by not telling a child what to do, is that deeper love than when the parent does give advice? Absolutely. Because it's much harder to exercise restraint than it is to share. But that restraint is because of the deep love of the individual that you love. You want to give them the independence to be able to come to it on their own. You may be quiet for a while. But the quiet can be misunderstood as being not caring, being detached. And that's the big mistake that we make. So God created an agnostic universe, but not because He wanted to be concealed, but He wanted us to be wise enough to dig deeper and understand there's something more going on here. You don't want to call it a test, but it's something like, and I don't want to really compare it to this, but it's something like if somebody really loves someone and that person has hurt them, not in any form of retribution or getting even, they may withdraw to see what you'll do. And if you really love the person, you're going to dig deeper, not pull back and go and pursue pursue the person, find a way to reconcile. So to go back to the analogy of Philip Partridge, he says is that the 3 weeks is the first stages of this type of withdrawal, of this type of separation. The fact that we have a separation in our own lives, the dissonance, this disparity between who we are and what we do, is a direct result of God's concealing His presence from us. Which means when you wake up in the morning, in simple English, you feel your body before you feel your soul. It takes effort and meditation, contemplation, to connect to something that's spiritual. It doesn't take anything to connect to something that's material. Your body tells you in the morning, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired. Your soul, you need to be a lot more sensitive and have a lot more acute hearing to hear the voice of your soul. Because it's much more subtle and not as aggressive and loud, and it's not as natural. Because there's a concealment going on here. But as the Kabbalists and the mystics explain, within this concealment lies more depth and more power than in the revelation. So in a strange way, the material concealment of everything that is spiritual has more power than the spirit itself has. So it's like a teacher wanting to reveal more. And each of the 3 weeks refers to the 3 stages in in the intellectual stages. We talk about Chochmah, Bina, Da'at. The 3 stages of withdrawal, with the first one being a withdrawal on the level of Chochmah. I'll explain this in a moment. The second on the level of Bina, and the third on the level of Das. Okay? So what does it mean in simple English? It means like this. When we conceive of an idea, it goes through 3 stages. The first is the concept, spark, the flash of an idea. It's a point. Mathematically, you can think of it as the dot, a point. Then comes a development like the line. So you have a point, a line, and a plane. The line is an extension of the point where you begin to flesh out and develop the concept. And Das is sometimes called intimacy. Das is the conclusion. The conclusion where it all comes together and you have like the full dimensional concept. So he explains that the 3 weeks, each week refers to a concealment or a withdrawal on those 3 levels. I'll explain in a moment psychologically. I just want to finish what he says. So the first one would be where the teacher is not completely withdrawing, he's only withdrawing on the concept level. That's the first week, Chochmah. The second, he's also withdrawing his explanation level. And the third is the total withdrawal of his connection with the student. So in psychological terms, as I mentioned, I want to apply it to that case study I mentioned before. In any type of relationship, and I mean even with ourselves, and definitely with other people, there's like 3 aspects to a relationship. One is that there's some point that connects 2 people. It's a spark. Some people call it actual spark. It's a chemistry. It's something that you can't really even define in terms. It's just an intangible. But it's there. And it's the beginning of every relationship. It's the first spark. Without that, relationship usually will not even be able to be ignited. Okay. The second stage is what we call Bina. That's Chacham. Bina. Bina is already a developed stage. Here you can absolutely define it. You see the qualities in another person, you can explain it, you respect and have appreciation of that individual, whether it's their intelligence or it's their emotions or it's their personality. And then comes the third thing, which is Das, which is, in a way, it's similar to the first, but it's actually at the other extreme. Das is when there's a total bond. It's called intimacy. Das is intimacy, when 2 people become one. Now, the difference between the first and the last is the first, it's a spark that's the beginning of a relationship, and the last is where a relationship gets consummated. That's why in Torah, sexuality, actually, intimacy between man and woman is called Das. Adam and Eve, they knew each other. That's what it says. And Adam knew Eve. Because knowledge is a form of complete intimacy, where there's a joining of 2 people. And it comes after there's the first 2 things, Chochmah and Bina. And the example of a teacher and a student, the example would be is Chochmah is a spark. It's a concept. You have the urge to want to share something with someone. You haven't yet developed it. You just have, the point has been, so you just share a certain point. Then the second stage is where it's developed into a full-bodied communication. And the third is when there's a real bonding between the 2. Now, in a relationship, I've mentioned before this case study, you can apply it very simply. If 2 people, and I'm just using this example, and many other examples, 2 people have difficulty with intimacy, a couple, it didn't begin with there. Guaranteed it, especially if they were once very close to each other, then if they're having problems there's no question that it began a Chochmah and Bina before it got to Das. So the question is, how do you get to the root and identify it? When, right now you see the symptoms. So here it's critical to really break down and say, how did we get here? Is it a lack of Bina? Is it a lack of, respect for another person's tools, things that are tangible, the things you can identify? Or is it the Chachmah part, that so-called that spark was lost? Obviously we'd like to believe that the most problems are on the second level, because the spark was there, but once, there can be a spark between 2 people, but then life takes over, and a person does not live up to expectations, is not responsible, doesn't do certain things that are expected in a relationship. After a while, the other partner becomes worn down. So the spark was there, and if you ask them, is there any love? They'll say, yeah, it's there, but it doesn't have anywhere to manifest. It's like chokhmah, it's like a spark there that's hanging around, but it doesn't have any manifestation in this world. So obviously, it's going to bring a breakdown to step 3 of intimacy, to use that example. And to apply, to broaden it, in a sense that can be applied to almost any psychological situation, the 3 weeks, God did not allow the Babylonians and the Romans to destroy the temple overnight, because He wanted to teach us that everything is a process. First of all, if you stop it in its tracks, the siege could be stopped, and they won't end up burning down the temple. If you don't stop it, that's when things accelerate. As I mentioned before, nothing happens just overnight. It takes time till things get to a place. That's the 3 weeks. But what are the actual 3 stages? The first stage is where the teacher, as I said, stops conceiving of an idea. The second stage is where there's no communication altogether, meaning there's no the fleshing out and the development of it. And then finally there's the third, which leads, of course, into Tisha B'Av, where there's a complete separation. As long as there was a temple standing, even though the temple was surrounded and the walls were besieged, there was still the connection was there. The destruction of the temple takes place when is the real disparity, when is the schism, the break take place once those 3 weeks pass, not in the beginning. So in any type of situation, you're always going to have these 3 stages. Every psychological situation, you can identify these 3 steps. These 3 steps, 3 ways that we can destroy our lives. One is, it can be on the level of the spark, where that is being compromised. Number 2, it can be in the level of the details. That really is where life lives itself out. And the third, which is usually a result of the first 2 deteriorating, is on the level of the intimacy, on the connection, on the deep connection between 2 individuals. Or within our own selves. I mentioned before, children. Children in a healthy, natural environment have all 3 things going on. Children growing up in a healthy home, they will have the chokhmah, bina, and das that their parents give them. There's the spark, of course. There's the love. There's the basic love that a parent has to a child. Then there's the details, what the parent does for the child. The time you spend with the child, the food you give, you provide for it, the confidence, the nurturing, all the details. That's the bina part. And then there's the intimate part. There's that the profound connection that a healthy parent has to a child, that a child senses it. A profound connection that develops over the years, and it's a very strong bond. As opposed to the first spark, as I said, is the beginning. There's the pure spark. A child is born. But even parents, even though you can't say their love changes over the years, but it's very different when you love your newborn child and you love your 20-year-old, for example. Not fundamentally different. It's the same love, but it's a whole different manifestation. The love of a newborn is simply it's your child. It really doesn't matter. You don't even know what kind of child this will be. You love the child no matter what happens. When a child is already 20 years old, or even older for that matter, now you're loving a child that you've seen many different things. You've seen the child grow, gone through different situations. You can love also the talents of the child, other things the child has developed. And there's a different type of bond that has a lot more manifestation than it does in the spark level. Mother loves a child even when the child is in its womb. You begin to love your child. You haven't even seen the child yet. There's just that essential connection. That's chokhmah. Bina is when it fleshes out and starts developing. And das is the so-called, the full body, the full connection that comes at the end of the process, so to speak. Even though in life you can't say there's an end to the process, but meaning that comes later in the stage is more the mature love that comes, when you see a mother and a daughter who are now, the daughter herself is a married woman, and they talk to each other. It's a different type of, it doesn't have the same type, it's a different type of connection, but much more profound, because they both have now lived through life, part of life together in that way. So, this is all in the healthy side of things. But sadly, I have to talk about the other side, even though I'd rather not. But we live in a world where we do have to. What happens when these 3 things are not there? That's where the problems begin. So now we have the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks are not here to tell us when things are working well. The 3 weeks are here to tell us when things are being concealed. And there can happen on 3 levels that we can lose a connection to ourselves. and to those around us. One is the spark itself. Sadly, you have parents who, even though naturally they should love their children, but either due to their own dysfunctionality, unavailability, or addictions and distractions, even the spark is almost not there. Not to say that a parent has no love, but you see things that even on a very basic level. There's someone recently, more than once, but recently I remember someone sharing with me, she said to me, I think from the day one that I was born, I think my mother never... What? Close the door, just close the door, that's all. Simple as that. Why don't you just close the door? So, from even day one, I don't feel that my mother was able to ever look at me. Now, first, you think sometimes you hear these things are exaggerated, but then you find out that people, due to their own either selfish, narcissistic lives, or whatever it is that messed them up, even that level. And unfortunately, you see parents do some of the worst things, even at the youngest age of a child, where you think a child is completely helpless and dependent, so you'd have the basic empathy. Then there's a lack that takes place on the bina level. The spark may be there, but the bina level, the love is there, but the parent is never around. Either they're busy working for the security of their children, but in the process take away the security of their children. And you don't have any type of, you start thinking, any time spent, any nurturing, all the things that have to come through the details of life, day after day, the bina level. Then, of course, there's the third level, which in most cases is a result of one of the first two missing. Usually it ends up being a relationship that's not going to be very solid. So when parents come and complain and say, I don't have a relationship with my children, and you ask them, how old are your children? 25, 30 years old. So when exactly did this relationship break down? So they think it broke down now, because now the children are old enough to not want to have a relationship with them. But why should the child not want to have a relationship with them suddenly? It began 25 years ago. But nobody likes to look at themselves, so you blame the child. Say, and I have to tell the parent, you don't mean to say when he was 2 years old, he wanted to have a relationship with you, but you didn't want to have one with him or her. And now he's 25 and you want one. You've already, in a way, you've written your own script. And again, I don't want to simplify this in generalizations, because there's so many different scenarios. I just want to give a few different examples, but they apply to all of us. They apply to all of us in our lives in many different ways. Because you see, I was talking here about parents and children simply because it's easier to explain, but we all have in our own lives, even within ourselves, things that we're lacking. You can identify, when you talk about the roots of something as opposed to the symptoms, you can identify, if you really look closely, which is the weakest area that a person is lacking their own self-confidence. Is it on the spark level? Is it on the development level? Or is it on the intimate level? For example, many children who are shy in school, so perhaps today educators and parents are trained, not always, but let's say it's gotten a little better, maybe it hasn't, I'm not sure. So shy children often, I remember my own class, kids that were shy were seen as stupid. They never spoke up, and so on. Some of the smartest kids are very shy. Because they didn't express themselves doesn't mean they have nothing to say. A good teacher recognizes that and tries to identify. Then you have people who are very expressive and they don't have much to say. They're not necessarily that gifted. I mean, everyone has their qualities. There are people who are chachma people, there are people who are bina people. There are people who are very good conceivers of ideas, but they don't know how to communicate well. Definitely don't know how to flesh it out. They have an idea, they can't even, sometimes they say the idea doesn't even sound right. Now someone who appreciates can say, I hear something there. Now, often we're not good judges of ourselves, so we're good to have someone else judge. Like so if you say, well, I'm a chacham, nobody understands me, but I think I'm saying the most brilliant things in the world, it would be good to try to get some corroboration from someone besides yourself for that, just as a footnote. But the fact is, there are people who are chacham, they are good conceivers, but they don't have words. They're not good at fleshing things out. There are people who are very good flesh out things, but they don't have they're not conceivers. Actually, you need both in any good company. You need someone that's a concept person. You need someone who knows how to concretize it, to make it actionable, as they say, to plan it. Which is greater? They both are necessary in this world. Obviously, chachma begins there. But what is chachma alone? A concept, a spark, without, a parent can love a child, but if the parent doesn't have any clue how to do anything for that child, naturally we usually figure it out on the job. But for argument's sake, theoretically, then the love is there, but you haven't done anything about it. It's like a love in your heart, and you haven't acted on it. So you really need both. And it's not always easy to identify where the problem is, because you need to have, as I said, a trained eye. And then there's the intimate thing. The intimate connection, das, is of course the most complicated one, because a person could have chachma bina, they could have a concept, they could have the connection, they could have a sense of self, they could have it fleshed out, but they lack intimacy. They call it today commitment problems, issues. People have commitment issues. Everything is right on paper, but you will never get their total commitment. What's going on here? There are people that are brilliant, and they're able to communicate, but you never get the final story. Well, it's usually as a result of fear. But this is a harder fear. You see, the shy child needs to be taught to have courage to speak, to have courage to express, to be taught some tools how to express. You have many things inside of you, and in this world it's helpful to express. Some people need to teach them through writing. They can't maybe speak, so they write. Some people have difficulty communicating, for whatever reason. It could be they were laughed at, or in their own homes have been silenced by insecure adults, and so on. There are many different factors involved. But there are methods for sensitive teachers, sensitive adult parent, can figure out. But the third type of lack, which is where the destruction of the temple takes place in the third week, Tisha B'Av, that's already destruction of Das. That gets more complicated, because here you're not just dealing with teaching new tools, you're dealing with very deep-rooted, deeply embedded fears are usually the reason that a person cannot able to completely commit. No one will ever admit that. They'll give you every reason why they don't commit. But the bottom line is, look at their whole life story, you'll see there's no commitment anywhere. So this has to tell you something, People like that, especially who are smart, will say, I didn't commit in this case because this happened, in this case that happened. They always blame something, either someone else or a situation. It's very hard to look at yourself and say, maybe I just have fear and I cannot go all the way, and I can't take that risk. Some people have a fear of that risk. So when we talk about the different things that we can cause, the damages we can create, it really comes down to these three levels, which are like the 3 weeks, the Chachma Bina Das. And you could identify, as I said, if you look closely and if you think about it, it's not that difficult to identify which one it is. And when you develop this into a formula, you really can apply it to almost any given situation. Not necessarily automatically solve it, but at least identify. And then becomes the process, okay, once I've identified, what's the way to approach it? In marital type of situations, marital therapy, what one tries to do at all times is to try to reignite a spark. Because if there's no spark, there's no hope, no one's going to work on anything. Two people say, we've grown apart, I have no feelings anymore. Whether it's true or not, what are you going to do with that? We've nothing to work with. What you want to do is say, is there somewhere the spark may be still there, but let's say it's been neglected, or it's been undercover, or it's been even betrayed or hurt. You want to find that connection. So spark is critical in that level. There are many situations where you could find the spark, the chokhmah part, but what's lacking is the tools. People love each other perhaps. There's a connection, but they just don't know how to behave with each other. Every day is another battle, because they've never figured out the details. the details clash, and sometimes the details can undermine the spark itself as well. And then there's the third dimension, which is on the intimate level. The intimate level, as I said, always comes after the first two, in most cases, because it's a result of them. Why no two people will ever be really intimately trusting of each other if they don't have the first two? And when I say intimacy, I mean much more than just sexuality and physicality. I mean an intimate connection where two people really find a certain, as the Torah says, they become one flesh. They become like one. So, taking the 3 weeks, you can really develop, as I said, formulas that can be applied to any psychological situation, all about the dissonance, the disparity, the split between who we are and what we do. And discovering what exactly is the root of it. And finding out where the vacuum is that can be filled. Because that's the key. So the 3 weeks is an opportunity for all of us to step back. You don't have to wait for a crisis. 3 weeks is telling you there was a crisis once, and is the root of all crisis. The root of crisis is when there's a disconnection between you and your source, you and your purpose, your calling. And when there's that disconnect, it will lead to destruction of one form or another, either the spark level, the detail level, or the intimate level, or the connection level. People who have all three, you can see it very clearly. You see that they have all three working pretty well. People are lacking, it's usually lacking one of those three, and often one leads, as I said, to the next. So, in the 3 week period, the point is to focus on what is it that we're lacking, with, of course, the goal of understanding, as I said before, that it's a process. Once you identify something, then you begin the healing process, because the identification itself, awareness, is half the cure, and that the process of the concealment leading to a revelation. So as one goes through this, really the goal is to understand that, okay, this is the separation, this is the concealment. How can this be turned into a catalyst for growth? But that's only possible once you identify what the issue is. As I said, the biggest mistake we make is we get ourselves in the quicksand of a problem and you're stuck. And that's it. You begin struggling and it gets worse and worse because you lose energy. You drain yourself from doing anything. Instead of identifying, and usually best with an objective friend, what the problem may be is, and now let's see what we can do. What we do is we create more problems by just continuing to flail and dig ourselves deeper. Look at it like someone who is, God forbid, you bring a patient into an emergency room and they're bleeding. The first thing doctors do is you have to stop the bleeding. Because without stopping the bleeding, and both physically and also figuratively, you can't identify anything. The bleeding just is blocking the ability to see where's the wound. And psychologically, the same is the case. When things aren't working, what happens is, like the drowning victim syndrome, you begin to flail your hands to the point where even a trained lifeguard comes to you, you'll pull them down. That's where you need to be trained, know how to save a person like that. Because you're so desperate for anything to hold on to that you pull down the thing that comes to save you. So the critical component is to realize that a problem is a problem as long as you as long as you feed it. As soon as you stop feeding it, so it's still a problem, but now you've isolated it. You ever get nervous when you start untangling wires that have become tangled all over the place, or even better, a ball of yarn? Where and the less patience you have, the worse it is, right? Because you start pulling here and pulling here, pulling things. By the time that, forget about it. Now at this point, you can't even do anything without tearing it or cutting through the tangles and knots. That's the tendency we have. The step of restraint, of being able to identify and say, okay, 1 second. Here's the issue. There's a problem here. Let's stop. Let me get some help here. Let's stop the bleeding. Figure out what exactly is the issue here. May not be so easy to identify, but as soon as you stop, instead of feeding at least it's not getting worse. It's like getting lost in the woods and stop walking. That's it. Enough. Stop being so smart and thinking you're going to find your way. Stop walking. So at least one thing, you're not going to get further lost. You may not find your way, but you're definitely not going to make it worse. This is the process of the 3 weeks, which is why we don't celebrate weddings and we don't do things to distract ourselves. It's a time of introspection. It's a time of focusing in on yourself and looking at where exactly, identifying what exactly are the areas that require some help. Now, of course, to apply this, when we can apply this to our personal lives, our own inner demons and fears, and we can apply it to our relationships with others. We can apply it to basically any given situation where there's a challenge or a difficulty or a problem. And hopefully I laid out at least some of the framework of these ideas. I hope that everybody could find something here that they can apply to your life. As I said, this will be a theme that I'll be speaking about some more in the coming weeks as these weeks unfold. But above all, it's to remember that the way to get rid of all problems is to fill the vacuum. And at the end of the day, as the prophets of these weeks tell us, they talk about the pain and the difficulty, but they say at the end, like Yeshaya will say, by the third week, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, that Zion is redeemed through law, through Torah, and its captives through charity. The way we ultimately counteract the 3 different types of descents, the 3 types of damages, the 3 healing steps of healing that counteract the 3 steps of destruction, is ultimately through filling our lives with things that are abundant, overabundant, compensating for the split that create connection. When a person gives to another, you automatically are counteracting the force of separating between you and another. When a person is connecting with another, you're also connecting more with yourself. Which is why in these weeks, it's a healthy thing to do, is to add in both in Torah study and in charity. Because those are 2 forces that counteract the negative forces of the vacuums and the steps that led to destruction. In the destruction of our own psyches, so to speak, in the things that we cause our own damage, the best way to resolve it is to find something that counteracts that split. And the simplest way is connecting to others, is to finding something to be extra sensitive, to be extra empathetic, to be extra connected. That is the best response to disconnection. So Chachma, Bina, Das, all 3 of them have their connection, have their the destruction, but they also have their repair. And the repair is on all those 3 levels. There are things where we connect like a spark, the initial connection. There are things where we connect through the details, and then there's the intimate connection that happens between ourselves. So in the 3 weeks, the best way to counteract or to so-called heal from any of these schisms that I mentioned is to do something on all those levels that create that type of connection. I often talk about parents and children, and this really can also be with yourself. You're the parent of your own inner child, and nurturing your own inner child. There are 3 things that you can do to really love yourself and love others. One is just that type of kiss or hug that you give your child. It's not for no apparent reason. You don't need any specific reasons. The second is things you do, specific things you say, the details, which this does have reason. This has specific things that fit to your child's needs, or as if it's your own inner child to your own inner child's need. This is like Bina. The first is like Chachma, does that hug, that embrace. And Bina is where you flesh it out. It's in details. What would you like today? Let's talk about. Let's go somewhere. Let's learn something. Let's discuss whatever it is that comes down into details. And then there's the third thing, which is learning to trust yourself and learning to embrace yourself. Not just as a hug or embrace, but more of a mature connection to who you really are. To say to myself, do I really love myself? Do I really love my child? Do I really love another person? And this is already something that comes, as I said, it's more of a mature love that comes with after you know the details. And after the initial spark, it comes a different type of relationship. It's like a mature relationship that results over time and over the years when we become really connected with each other. And so the 3 weeks are an opportunity an opportunity to look at of course, the negative side, but above all, to connect on the positive side. I said I will definitely develop these ideas and discuss them more in the coming weeks. I hope, as I said, I laid out some of the basic principles, and as I said, if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to either connect. You can even ask them here if you like, but also by email or any other way. Some of these ideas, I think most of what I've said here tonight, I've not really taught, or written about or taught before, but there's always some overlap, and I'd be happy to share more if I have more in writing. And I also want to say that this class is dedicated, firstly, Chav Beis Tam is the Yotzer of Shlomo Zalman ben Avram Yitzchak Halevi, father of Malka Stern. So may the neshama have an aliyah on the 22nd of Tammuz, which really means coming up. Chav Beis Zayin was Shabbos, so Chav it's actually today. Yeah, tonight. Yeah. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman ben Avram Yitzchak Halevi, and our Refuah Shlema, health, immediate and speedy recovery for Moshe Tzvi Akayin ben Freidel. So the merit of the study and the learning that we had today, may this neshama have aliyah, and this neshama have health and a body, and for many healthy good years. And everyone else in this period of time in the 3 weeks, just like we talk about schisms and health and lack of health, above all, the goal is to be healthy souls and within healthy bodies, and that we should be able to fulfill our calling, our mission in this world, and God sent us here. Each of us has something unique and indispensable that only you and only you can fulfill. Nobody that ever lived or ever will live can do but you. And to me, that's always the biggest root of all healing, actually, because when you have that connection, then there's nothing in the world, not a pain, not a trouble, not a setback, and also not the gifts that we take for granted can deter us, because you know that everything that comes your way in life is part of your mission, part of your indispensable mission. So please, we need you to fulfill your mission. This is a request and also a expectation, but we need each other in this context because we can't do it without each other. And so, with that being said, I want to wish everybody an elevating 3 weeks, where we use these 3 weeks for only growth and healing, and getting places that are not just healing. Real healing is not just absence. Health is not just the absence of illness; it's also a state of completion, a state of wholesomeness. That every one of us should experience that in the fullest sense. And Philip is not giving his class. Okay, Philip will not have his class. We will continue next Wednesday. We will be here, most likely. Yeah, we will let you know if there's any foreseeable changes. Changes rather in the foreseeable future. I said foreseeable changes. Okay, maybe that too. And always an honor and pleasure to say a few words to all of you, especially as I come back, as I said, from the Holy Land, and I still have the air of the Promised Land inside my lungs for I don't know how much longer, but meanwhile they're still there. Yeah, it lasts. Okay, and a few falafels as well, Israeli style. And thank you very much. Good.